continue, if I may, on the theme of the transitional provision in Part 2. And, I think my colleague Carol Beaumont made some very good points about the questions, I think, that are still there about the 90-day provision. But I wanted to be a little bit more positive for a moment about the reference in the transitional provision, and it refers back to section 64, if I can find it, which is about employers having to retain a copy of individual employment agreements or individual terms and conditions of employment. And that is one provision in this bill that Labor supports. We didn't get to talk about it because we didn't have enough time in the previous debate, but we do support that. We do support workers having the right to their individual employment agreements in writing, and they're supposed to anyway. So we think this is an improvement to the current situation, but the other reason I think it's an improvement, although I don't think it's going to help the hapless souls that are employed under the 90-day trial period, all of those in every workplace in New Zealand that change jobs in the future. Because when we go back to the Labor Department research on the existing arrangements for workplaces of 20 or less, it was very interesting to look at what was happening with individual employment agreements. Not only did 1 in 4 of the workers not end up with a job, after the 90-day trial period that was supposed to create jobs for all of these people, and particularly so-called vulnerable workers and migrant workers, Māori workers and so on, hardly any of them, there was no evidence to show that that would contribute to increasing their employment in any way, shape or form. But, when we looked at the other parts of the evidence in that survey, some of the employers didn't even put the conditions in writing. So I think there's pretty widespread practice out there of having individual agreements that aren't in writing, even though it's a current requirement of the law. It's a current requirement of the law, and and actually, even where employers did put it in writing, of course, the condition was non-negotiable. So, it's one thing to have written employment agreements and individual agreements. We support that. It's another to have non-negotiable individual employment agreements. And that's the problem all the way through this bill because, of course, the whole 90-day trial provision is not voluntary. It's not going to be subject to good faith. Well, good faith is meaningless in this situation, and we've been hearing and relayed some of the stories about it and the impact on that. Actually, the same report said that employers generally did not seek employees' acceptance of a trial period in an individual agreement. Rather, it was stated in the employment agreement with other terms and conditions. So, for most people, most workers applying for a job, the job was conditional on their accepting a trial period. So although we support this transitional provision and its reference back to section 64, I think that the Prime Minister's statement and other ministers who said that the 90-day trial period could only be entered into by written agreement between the employer and the new worker at the beginning of the employment relationship has been shown by their own research, their own department's research, to be completely untrue, to be utter rubbish. Now, I noticed also during the Select Committee process, the Select Committee made a change to the section 64(2)A that transitional provision refers to make it clear that the employee may have access to a copy of the employment agreement retained by the employer. Well, there's a good idea. I think that's a very good idea. Of course, it's a good, of course they should have access to their employment agreement, their individual employment agreement. But you see, the reality is in many workplaces they don't. So it's a good improvement. It will improve things, although most, many employers who are going to take advantage and exploit the 90-day trial provision actually will ignore this anyway. It's meaningless for them. And what we've been hearing about that is, from many workers is, we've got the 90-day trial thing now, so we don't have to tell you, or we don't have to give you an agreement. We don't even have to agree. So you can write these things down, and they are improvements, but I have to say, I have no confidence that they're going to make a huge difference. And I think, just picking up the point of my colleague Carol Beaumont about transitional provisions and what could be considered, I wonder how on earth we're going to get an education program going, and what resources that the Minister and others are planning to put into this, because this is a huge change. We are going to... thousands of workplaces.
Chair.
Lynn